So let's talk about data. First data point, I see 0 teachers in the front row here. No eager beavers, which really disappoints me. But it's okay, I understand. I was a student too. That's totally all right. So we're really looking forward to supporting the mission of CSNYC and sharing some of these basics of data science, both for all the teachers we have here today and for all the students that may be seeing a lot of this in the future. So we'll also be sharing out this presentation over the coming weeks, so don't worry too much about taking detailed notes or following on every word. You'll get all the materials in your inbox. So just to start, for those of you who haven't heard of CB Insights before, I'll give you the 30-second overview on what we do here. So CB Insights is a tech market intelligence platform that analyzes millions of data points on startups, patents, news mentions, and so on, to give our customers a glimpse ahead into these emerging tech areas and emerging industries. So this is a space that's traditionally been a little bit more sparse in terms of hard numbers, so we're very excited to be bringing our data-driven approach to it. So this takes us right into our company motto, which actually fits our session very well. In a lot of fields where people are trying to look ahead and forecast or predict a trend, there's always a lot of loud voices shouting about the next big thing. So our emphasis here is really on data over decibels when it comes to this kind of work. And just a little bit about my background here. I'm a tech industry analyst here on the research team. So we use our data and our CB Insights database to generate reports and presentations on emerging startup fields like auto tech, self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, you name it. Before this, I also worked as a consultant, so most of my professional experience has really been around data analysis. And on the right there, you have my Twitter handle and email address. I'm always happy to take any follow-up questions or field any data questions you might have after the presentation. Before we get into it, here's our agenda for the next half hour or so. We'll start with a quick refresher of some basic Excel functions. And then we'll move into key principles for working with a raw data set and bringing that into meaningful analysis. Next, we'll apply those principles live with a sample walkthrough of a retail sales data set. And finally, we'll wrap up with some questions at the end. But we want this to be interactive, so feel free to raise your hand and ask questions at any point. So in the feedback for this session, we heard that we want to focus more on the data process and analysis example, more so than going through literal Excel functions. So today we're just giving a brief run through of the essentials rather than anything comprehensive. This is more for everyone to get on the same page and to have an idea of the basic Excel skills that we look for in our candidates so that you can better communicate that to your students. So obviously Excel has many built-in functions that you can use to manipulate, summarize, or transform your data. The example you see here is the most basic sum formula of 2 different cells. But Excel has hundreds of these functions that require different types of data or inputs. So the formula finder is actually a great way to discover new functions and figure out how to use them, and that comes right from the formula bar in Excel. Of course, there's almost no one on earth that knows all these functions, so it's a really helpful tool that's built right into Excel and helps clarify this for both a first-time user and someone who's maybe forgotten a few things and just wants to look up something. So here's a list of some other commonly used functions. Usually these are simple math operations like average or median, but also if functions or conditionals that allow you to test for specific criteria in your data fields. You can see some examples at the bottom there. I'm counting the number of matches in this data set from the US. In a classroom setting, this could be used for something like counting the number of test scores above or below a certain grade. And again, we won't spend a lot of time going through all of these, but there are many in-depth guides and tutorials that are freely available online. Conditional formatting is another tool that's easy to use because it's built right into the main Excel menu bar. So here we have a bunch of options for automatically highlighting or coloring cells. In the example up top, we're highlighting all of the cells above $15 in red. And on the bottom example, you can see we're using a color scale to visually sketch out the values from low to high. So this is just really helpful for visualizing trends and patterns at a glance, especially when you have a lot of data and don't want to wade through the weeds of looking at all the individual figures. Next, we have reference functions like VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP. So that's short for vertical lookup and horizontal lookup. Before we go through this, how many of you have used these lookup formulas before? Okay, a handful. Okay, so that's good that we have this then. So if you haven't, don't worry so much about all the details that you see up here. The general concept is that these functions are very helpful for pulling together different sets of data without having to do a lot of manual copy pasting, matching this value to another. In the business world, it's pretty rare that a data set comes consolidated with everything that you need together. And very often you have to stitch things together, so these formulas really come in handy for that. Finally, we have pivot tables. If you aren't super familiar with these, again, that's okay. These are some of the most used Excel analysis tools because they're very flexible and allow you to do a lot of different types of analysis and filtering without writing out a ton of formulas. Once you get the hang of these, you can go from a raw data set to dozens of different analysis cuts in minutes, so it's a very powerful tool for that. So let's get into the actual data thought process and move on to some key principles for working with data. As requested, we've framed everything in the context of real-world data business analysis, rather than hypothetical examples. So we'll keep that in mind as we go through it. The first step is really cleaning and sanity checking your data. This is arguably the most important step in the whole process because it doesn't matter how sound or how complex your analysis is if the data set you're working off is fundamentally wrong. So when studying statistics, myself as a student and many other students often see practice data sets that are pretty clean from the start. But with a business data set, things are rarely that way. They're rarely so nice and sanitized, and they're much messier. So this is a really crucial step. And one thing that we train analysts to do here at CB Insights is really not to take this data for granted. And this graphic shows how it's sort of an ongoing and cyclical process as you work your way through a data set. At the end of a project, let's say, if you're working for a CEO, you can't just turn to him and tell him, sorry, all of our results are off because the file you sent us at the beginning had a bunch of duplicates and errors in that. So it's really, as an analyst, it's your responsibility. And if a student or any given analyst is thinking about working in these fields, it's a crucial step in the process. So after you've done some initial cleaning, next we can work through transforming and enhancing your data set. Here's a couple questions to consider. For example, can you merge or stitch together data sets for a richer analysis? Can you bucket or segment certain data fields, like different types of customers you might have if you're a retail business selling to customers? Are there different price segments among products that are really important? And can we recode any of our data fields, like binary discrete variables, turning something that's a continuous function into a simple yes or no sort of variable? So once that's done, you're ready to get into the analysis. So not to get too deep into the statistics here, most of the time when you're doing this sort of analysis in a business context, you're just trying to find an interesting relationship between your key variables. So if you can find a meaningful link that can be used directly to inform your business strategy, this is really better explained with some examples. So just looking at that blue box on the bottom, for example, where's the most startup funding going to by tech sector and by year? This could tell an investor where are the hottest areas that they should be putting their money. Or if you're a product company and you're selling smartphones, let's say, you can break down how your sales vary by region or different types of customers. Maybe you can identify some weak points that you want to go after with marketing or another part of your strategy. So once you've teased out an interesting trend from your analysis, naturally the next step is thinking about a visual way to highlight or communicate your data result. So here's a few ideas from our work just to kickstart the conversation. For general purposes, the basic charts and formatting tools built into Excel are more than sufficient, so let's take a look at a few of these. There's always your bar chart and line chart. Here we're looking at quarterly funding to drone startups since 2012. These are pretty basic, but they're still pretty useful for quickly spotting high-level trends. It's pretty obvious that the funding here to drone companies has been on the upswing, but has fallen off a little bit into 2016. Heat maps are another idea. You can build these pretty easily using that conditional formatting tool that we went over earlier. So with this example here of AI healthcare companies, what you can tell right away is that the categories up top are really hot for investment, that you can see highlighted there in red, while the ones on the bottom really aren't seeing as many deals. So a great way to look at data real quickly without actually having to dig through the individual numbers and quickly tease out a trend. Here we have a bubble chart example. This goes beyond your basic scatter plot because you can show 3 dimensions of data instead of 2 when you add the size of each individual bubble itself. And finally, this is not coming out of Excel, but this is actually a CB Insights tool. This is a social graph that's mapping out some connections between big ride-hailing startups like Uber and Lyft and all of their mutual investors. So another way to look at a space here. Again, as with everything else we're going through today, there's countless examples out there of different types of visualizations to use. So we won't go through every single point, but these are just some ideas to get the juices flowing. So now that we've seen the basic data analysis process, let's go through our sales data example. We heard that you're most interested in doing a business case that you might encounter in the real world. So we pulled together a data set right off of Tableau, and today we'll be breaking down the sales data of an imaginary office retailer. I think something along the lines of Staples. Because it's based in Canada, let's call it Maple Co. Maple Co. is they're looking into their annual revenue, and they've noticed that it's declining over recent years. So they'd like us to explore some potential reasons why. So they've sent over this sales data set to us for us to analyze and generate some preliminary views. I'm going to stop here before we jump right into the example. Does anyone have any questions or anything they'd like to talk about at this point? Okay, let's get right into it. So this is our raw sales data set, and this is something that you'll see very commonly in the business world for any company that handles a lot of sales transactions. Could be a retailer, or it could be the company directly selling the products itself. So these different data fields you see here, usually you'll see something like a order ID mapping a particular order, pretty self-explanatory, the number of items in a particular row, the discount that was applied, revenue from that order, product name, and so on. So I've cleaned up this data set a little bit already, but let's do that a little bit more just to show you some examples. So just formatting all of these with the proper units, and looking through to make sure everything's complete. So up front, you'd want to make sure you understand each one of these columns. In this example, it's, everything is more or less self-explanatory, but clarifying everything up front is a key step in the process. So let's get into checking for some of those outliers, as we mentioned, as part of the data cleaning cycle. And a lot of this is really just sense checking. So one example here is thinking about the discount field. The amount of discount on a product logically couldn't exceed 100%. So let's go check this field just to make sure that that's the case. So we can write a quick conditional just to check if this is greater than 1 or not. And then we can use conditional formatting to highlight anything that is coming up as over 100%. And if we filter it, we should be able to find out if there are any. Now we are flagging 4 rows here. So you might be asking, why is this the case? And that's a good question, because if you're seeing something out of the ordinary, the first thing to do would be to get to the root cause of it. Is it that you have the wrong data in the first place, or is it a systemic problem with the company? And here, for example, you could go back to the data team on the MapleCo side, and they could say, oh, it's something we've seen before with some of our cashiers or sales reps just entering data in incorrectly, which does happen actually very often with these sort of systems. And there's always the element of human error whenever there's manual entry. So with that, we could just quickly take these out. It's usually a good practice to keep those rows in case you want to wonder why they're missing later or why something was taken out. So just call that tab removals. Okay. So another check that you'd often do, oops. Right, there we go. Another check that you often do with this sort of sales data set is looking for duplicates. Again, there's many reasons behind this, but with such a large data set, you can see this thing in total is about 8,000 rows. There's really potential for error here. So luckily, this data set has an order ID, which is usually good for checking that sort of thing. We can just count the number here to see if there are any duplicate entries. Of that given number. And again, use conditional formatting to highlight if there's any rows that show up more than once. Kind of filter for it. Filter for anything greater than 1.
I didn't get that filter box to pop up.
Oh, I'm sorry. So that's a great question. So all of the sorting and filtering functions are right over here. You can do basic sorts from A to Z, or custom sort. And actually, the filter command is the best because it gives you this little drop-down box that lets you sort any column by the values in it.
Oh, so you select filter and then you go to that drop-down box.
Exactly. So I'm using a few keyboard shortcuts, so I'm not clicking on the menu, but it's basically the same function. And you'd be able to filter for certain values, make sure anything's not popping up more than once, or just drill down on a specific field if you want to.
Got it.
Yep. Okay, great. Yes?
And so the rows that you select, is it everything below the label? You
Right.
select those rows and then you go to filter?
Right. So it'll pick up anything underneath it. So it's good to always make sure you're filtering on your top row, which is usually in a data set it's your data fields, it's the labels for each piece of data, but it'll pick up anything underneath. So let me just actually move this over. Realized I grabbed the wrong column. Okay. So really we just want to make sure there's no rows that are showing up more than once because we don't want to double count anything when it comes to talking about money and revenue issues. So again, we'll just grab all of these and take them out, throw them into the removals field.
Would you keep like one of each though, because the one of each is correct, or just all of them?
That's a good question. So just about to get to that. You're already ahead of me.
Oh, sorry. Freaking me out.
No problem. No, that's a great question. So you'd want to keep one because you still would want to count those orders once if you're thinking about the company's revenue. And an easy way to actually get that out of Excel is there's a built-in function under data called remove duplicates. And so what this is just a quick and easy way to find those duplicate rows, and Excel will take them out for you, and it'll leave one of each. So there will always be one left.
Wait, so you didn't have to do the order thing, you could have just done that at the beginning.
Right, you could, if you know about the function, you can do it up front.
Okay.
But sometimes it's good to manually look at the duplicates and see why they're there in the first place. Right. Again, just to know exactly why it is instead of accidentally removing something that might be valid, but is just coded incorrectly. So yeah, it's a meticulous in the weeds sort of process, but I think that's why this step is so important because if this is wrong, then there's almost no point in doing the analysis because you're going to get you could get such skewed results anyway. Okay, great. So our next step is doing some of those transformations and augmenting the data set as we talked about earlier. So it's being blocked a little bit, but if you look at the data set, there are a few more tabs in the file that MapleCode delivered to us in this example. So if we look through those, we have a tab for all the orders that were returned. Again, this is something we want to take out of sales data because if they returned it, we had to refund them, so we're not actually getting the revenue for these orders. So what I'm going to use is the VLOOKUP function that we talked about earlier to pull some of these things in. And again, don't worry so much about the exact details of how VLOOKUP works. There's plenty of tutorials out there. But essentially, I'm going to use the order ID to match with all the returned orders. And pull in all the rows that have been returned. So now, because I can sort and filter, I can quickly ignore those if I want to. Okay? And, uh-oh, I think it's gotten caught on something. All right. The next tab that they gave us was detailed information on their product, which often with the sales data and the product data could be delivered separately. These are much more useful in-depth details on a given product. Let's say, Xerox copier, different models of iPhones, what category and subcategory they belong to, and what their prices are. So again, this is something that would be helpful for us to have in this main data set. And once again, we can use the VLOOKUP function to do this matching automatically instead of doing it by hand. All right, bear with me for 1 second. All right, so we have the category, subcategory, and price for all of the products that are sold in this sales database now. So that's not just useful in the context of working here with business analytics. It's helpful for almost any data set you might have. It could be of your own students, and you want to match in test scores for individual students. Anything you want to put together, it's a really quick and easy way to do it, and makes it way less manual. Okay, great. So that's the basic process of cleaning and prepping the data set. The next step would actually be doing all the analysis and looking through the visualizations. So I won't put you through watching me do that manually. I actually did some of this ahead of time to give you some examples on a clean data set. So the first thing is going back to the problem we were given, and that was, MapleCode's revenue has been declining in recent years, and they like to know exactly what's going on. So just charting that in blue, the revenue in blue, and the number of individual orders in orange, we can see that for the most part, the data reflects what they're saying, which is good, because if it didn't, we'd have to go back to the data and go back to them and see why it's not lining up. But again, bar chart, line chart, pretty good for getting a high-level view on things, just so we better understand the situation they're in. Sorry, go ahead.
A little bit of a decline, right?
Right. So the big decline was after 2009. I guess it hasn't been a consistent decline, but just to fit the narrative of our data example, let's say that there was a sustained decline.
Okay.
But generally, they had a pretty big drop-off here of several $100 million, which is a pretty hefty amount. So they're looking into more reasons why that might be. Right. So this is actually in the thousands here. So pretty big in scale. So let's dig into more of why that's the case. And on this next tab, we really broke down that annual revenue figure across all the variables that we're pulling into our data set. So that could be the region that a product was sold, the customer type that an order went to, as well as the different sales manager for those regions. So we put together a bunch of analysis tables that looks at the split of revenue across those different variables. And just looking at the raw tables themselves, it's a little tough to see how these things come out at first glance. So again, we put everything into a chart to make it a little easier to see the trends. So this is looking at their sales by the different regions in Canada. Can't tell that much definitive here, other than Ontario revenue share going down over these years. So maybe interesting to look into that, whereas some of these are increasing. And the thing with data analysis is that you won't always get a meaningful result on your first try. So that's why it's helpful to have these different Excel functions and tools that let you do all of these different cuts quickly. So the next breakdown we did was by product category. This one's a little bit more compelling because we can see technology here in dark blue is increasing in share over time. So we're selling more technology products, or they're representing a greater proportion of MapleCo's revenue, while some of these are declining. So customer segment is actually where we see something really interesting for MapleCo. So they, like many of these large retailers, they sell to corporate customers directly, as well as to average consumers like you and I walking in to buy things, and people buying for their home offices. And here's where we see that corporate has really taken off share-wise over the past few years, while both home office here in the medium blue and consumer in light blue have really dropped off consistently. So this would be interesting to point out for them because, if this trend continues in a few years, over half of the revenue could be coming from a single type of customer, which could be kind of dangerous for them from a business strategy standpoint because you're becoming very reliant on one type of customer. And you want to see what's driving that loss in consumer share, perhaps. And just to be comprehensive, we also mapped it out by the different sales managers who are assigned to the different regions. And it looks like, for the most part, everyone's doing a good job. Maybe William especially is getting a big bonus this year because of how much his share is growing. And another analysis we did just for extra credit and just to understand things a little better is to look at all their different product categories that they sell in subcategories and see where is their revenue really going. So what's really bringing money in through the door for them. And one way to look at this is another chart that's built into Excel called the tree map. So this takes each one of these subcategories and gives it a little box and maps out the area according to how big its data point is. So real easy way to see at a glance that office machines are real big for MapleCo. Paper is not because it's much smaller. You could do this with a number of data sets as well.
How do you tell it that it's technology, furniture, office supplies?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a little zoomed in here. Good question. So in the little analysis table that I've built out, it has all those fields. So if you select all of this and insert a tree map chart, it'll basically do the job for you. All right. So those are just a couple examples of the analysis that you can do with a real-world sort of sales data example. Going back to this presentation now, let's bring some of that together as soon as I can get this slide up with some next steps and maybe some advice on how this really matters for students. So obviously the first thing is that Excel is not the only thing out there. You might be familiar with other statistical analysis tools like SPSS, R, and Stata. So these are really often used in business and academic applications for looking at large data sets and running regressions. So a lot of students will run into these at some point. But the reason why the Excel is the gold standard is because it's much easier to use. These programs have a higher learning curve because a lot of them run off command line interfaces. But that might be familiar to a lot of our computer science teachers in the room, so I figured it was worth showing. So we did all of that data, and we did that analysis, and what's the next step after that? Many times, analysis and data points are really only half of the puzzle, especially when you're trying to make your case to your boss, or a CEO, or whatever it might be. bringing the narrative together like this is key. Going back to our sales data analysis, we saw that Maple Co. Was losing revenue with their consumer and home office customers. So that's interesting in and of itself, but let's think a little bit more broadly on why we'd have to consider outside factors maybe. If you're thinking about this in the early 2010s, and after doing some research, you might find that it's not really to do with their internal product selection or their own managers, but it's that consumers are just moving to online shopping and e-commerce for their electronics and office supplies. So that broader context there is really valuable. So in general with all this, it's important, I think, to encourage students to keep an eye on the bigger picture and think critically beyond doing the raw data analysis and working with numbers. Because it's one thing to be really skilled with them, but you need to be able to communicate them at least, to influence business strategy. So bringing this all together, that brings us to the last request we had, which was what do we look at for tech industry analysts here at CB Insights when we're looking for potential candidates and throughout the hiring process. And as we were just saying, we do look for that blend of analytical horsepower and the ability to put those insights together in an elegant way that's easily communicated. Raw Excel knowledge and analytical skills, as I said, is really one piece of the equation, although it's always a plus when someone's a standout in Excel. All right, that wraps up all the content we had for you today. We have plenty of time for questions, so please feel free to ask any general questions about the process, data analysis, our hiring process here at CB Insights and how we think about that sort of thing, or specific questions about the data set we saw, any questions you might have about the example.
Before we start the question and answer, I just wanted to say, without trying to, that is one of the top 10 best presentations I've ever seen. That was amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm glad you think so.
And my first question is, have you considered teaching?
I always thought I was a terrible teacher, but I love actually teaching Excel skills and actually everything about this because it's, I feel like it's so applicable and it's kind of, you never learn it in the sort of business context. At least I learned a lot about data analysis in school, but it was always sort of theoretical. So I'm always happy to bring it down more to like the ground level and see like where does it really get applied. Anyone have any questions? Yes.
So what percentage of all this awesome stuff that you can do with Excel can you not do on Google Sheets?
Great question.
Because I've been fighting my school to use Google Sheets with
Right.
the collaborative nature.
Right.
And I'm telling them how archaic it is to use Excel, but then you just blew my mind a little bit.
Right. That's a hell of a question. I would say what we did today, you could probably do about 80 to 90% of it. Like the vast majority, like most people on a day-to-day basis don't need to use Excel. And Google Sheets is actually easier and faster and free. So it's really not that, it's not a requirement, I would say, but if you're doing something really complex, Google Sheets is a little bit simpler with their functions. So for advanced sort of data science and really doing crazy visuals, some of them are only doable in Excel. And I guess I would say, in my experience in the business world, a lot of old legacy businesses that have been around forever, people have only used Excel and it's the only thing they know. So that kind of makes it a de facto standard. And that's why, it's almost a rite of passage to learn it a little bit because it's the only way to communicate to some people in the business world. So yes and no, I guess. I don't know if that was the clearest answer, but that's my take on it. Anybody else?
I was just wondering, in
Sure.
addition to making steal someone's question. In addition to making the presentation available, can you make that data table available?
Yes, I could actually. I grabbed it off the internet myself, so it'll be up there. But I can make sure that specific example comes along with the with the deck, so you can put the 2 and 2 together.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? Yes.
Sorry, it's me again.
No, that's okay.
Second question, I'm using them all up. Would it ever be possible to like have us here and kind of doing something like that, like with computers in front of us and like following along in like a very simpler way? Because I do want to learn those things that you showed.
Yeah,
but,
no.
I don't know even where to start. Would it ever be, a good idea would be maybe we can just like grab our computers and like go slower and follow. Not that you went fast.
Definitely.
But, like where we are trying at the same time.
Yeah, right.
I want to learn all those shortcuts and stuff.
Yeah. So actually, some of the feedback we heard before this was more of like not doing the practical examples, but I think I'd be more than happy to do a work style or like a workshop style session where it's more of having an actual example and sending it to everyone. Maybe you guys have tables so you could put down a laptop and everyone could sort of do it at once.
So we'll invite you to. We run these weekend workshops where we can open up computers. Mm-hmm. Would you be interested? Would you be willing to come out on a Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why not. And to be honest, doing that sort of data training is what we do a lot with our new hires and our new analysts when we onboard them. So it's really sort of I could see it being almost the same exact process for a training session.
So there's computer science teachers, and there's really just teachers in general. Like every teacher should know VLOOKUP.
Right.
And it should be part of like how do you get a master's in education?
Right. Everyone should.
So it would be really, if you're willing to, we will.
No, definitely.
We'll give you the teaching.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
One quick comment and a question is, a lot of the teachers probably just have Google Sheets, so I don't know if you would be able to do some sort of training on using Google tools
Yeah.
for kind of analysis.
Yeah.
A lot of us are, a lot of us are like Google Apps for Education schools, but I think some of my questions as a teacher, I always find it hard to get a data set that will interest my students.
Yeah, right.
Even I might really like this sales data, but
Yeah.
really try to put a child's hat on
Right.
and say, what would they really like to analyze and process and tell a story about?
Yeah.
But then also, once we identify that theme of data, like how do we get it? So how do we get a rich source of data that we can actually process? So that's always ours on our end. We might eventually find it, but it's
Right.
really a lot of time.
It would be great to have something like that to share in the teacher community because, like, this is great for CSNYC, it's great for business world, but it's something that would, especially middle school kids,
Yes.
Right.
Just to add on to that, I'm sorry to add on to it, I just don't want to forget to say it, but so a lot of artists right now are using data sets to create art, but what is that, Python? Processing, that's it. So ITP, I don't know, at NYU's ITP, they have like all these, like one woman that I met, she created like dresses out of how many like times women were talked bad about in rap songs. And so I think that to really find data sets, because obviously you would ask your kids what kind of data sets they want, but you'd have to give them some ideas first to get their mind thinking. But perhaps seeing what university students are currently working on, like at the new school at ITP or something like that, and getting those ideas can give some thoughts to your students, and then letting them run with it, because nowadays with Socrata, isn't that it, or something, we have data everywhere. Like, if you talk to people that run those middle school hackathons or anything like that, like Museum of the Moving Image ran one, and seeing what the students are interested in. Like some of the students were doing, like working with data sets about like city bikes and where the city bike stations were, and we just had a presentation about the use of stop and frisk and data about that. Yes. So
Yeah.
I think that to look at that, I think when we want to look at data sets, you could look at what like the kids in school are doing, or like what like hackathon the kids are doing, or something like that. That's kind of where I would start.
But they just wanted it on their own. There's also
Yeah.
there's a lot of citizen science stuff too.
Oh yeah, like
There's
Yeah.
a lot of
So just
citizen science. It's pretty easy to get it.
Yeah.
Citizen science is there are apps where people you could help count ladybugs, or you can count a university students, and there are apps on your phone that anyone in the world can add data into it. It's called citizen science, so that you can produce observations, and then it all gets collected and it's usually made available. There literally was a ladybug one.
Yeah.
Because there's a disappearing, ladybugs are disappearing. And so there was an app to collect when and where do you see ladybugs.
Right. So just to weigh in on this a little bit, there's,
Grab the data sets. Most science museums will tell you about them. But if you just Google citizen science, there's tons and tons of
Yeah.
resources for it.
so my take on this is that a lot of it is actually available publicly. There's so much out there now because data science is blowing up as it is, and the government makes all of its data sets these days publicly accessible. So everything from like income to demographics and all of that, and there's so many repositories of really relevant data sets. You mentioned the city bike thing. Like a lot of these are really just out there. So what I can do as part of this deck is include a slide with some links to some of these databases. So I mean, there's literally thousands of these things out there, and chances are that if you look hard enough, you can find something that interests you as whether you're a teacher or a student or whoever you might be. The other thing was getting back to your question about Google Sheets. If we did a workshop style thing, it would mostly be around all of the basics that I think would apply to both. So like we wouldn't go through any Excel functions that aren't available in Google Sheets and vice versa. So that's a good point. I know that Google Sheets is really popular in educational circles and institutions, but I think there'd be a way to make it applicable for both.
Except for that tree.
Yeah,
That's the only thing that I saw you do tonight that's not in Google Sheets.
Right.
So I don't
Yeah. So it's the
something super nitpicky. So I was using Office 365 just because my school has it and I don't want them to. I want them to go to Google Apps. And I opened up an Excel spreadsheet in the browser based whatever, and then I shared it out, and someone opened up my Excel spreadsheet that I launched locally on their part. They opened it up with the local Excel,
Right.
and I was kicked out. So I don't know how collaborative is this?
Yeah.
It's my document, I'm in the web, and they're local, and they kick me out.
Yeah, it's not great for that, especially when you compare it to Google Sheets. But yeah, there's definitely pros and cons for both of them.
Katie, you had a question from a while ago.
I was also just going to add to the response about how we're going to get data. It was sufficiently answered. I was just going to suggest data.gov. I think our students did ones where they did like prison, like recidivism. Another one did the sanitation grades on restaurants, like in their neighborhood, so they would know which restaurants to avoid. Yeah.
When it comes to these data sets, while there are thousands available, what we need more of or more training in is the cleaning and sanitizing process and truncating them down to really 5 to 10 columns. 10 columns would be 10 fields is the maximum you can do.
Right.
For your broadest population of students. So I think actually for teachers, that first thing you talked about, we're like, can we take this data set and then turn it into a usable classroom size data set? If we could get really good at that, then the thousands of publicly available data sets become like a real resource. Right now, I think I would say most of us feel daunted by when I open up this data set, it has 120 rows. It has 120 columns. How am I going to get as many students, right?
Definitely. No, I agree, and I think, I mean, beyond that, the analysis itself is kind of repeatable once you get the hang of it.
Right.
So it's really getting through that cycle of like, how do I cut this down to size and still have something meaningful to work with?
Exactly.
Is we stress that here for a reason, I guess, and I'd be happy to run through that again, as well as some of the basic matching and filtering functions that you can use to do that.
Yeah, I find the presentation very applicable to class too. Like I'm thinking, even if I have my test score, I can have students analyze it. Then they will see what is the trend of what is the weakness, how is the grouping. So it will give them more incentive. I will give next time we do better, we have some prize, we'll do that again. It gives them really more incentive because they own it. They have the ownership of their data. It's very important.
Computer, we fill it out on paper.
It's more powerful.
I understand.
It's very
Very good.
Okay. Anyone else?
So our next weekend workshop is going to be data cleaning. So that's in stone. That's the next workshop. We're doing at least a 2-hour
Data cleaning and VLOOKUp. So
we'll coordinate with you. We'll definitely do that.
great, yeah. So it is going to be busy for us. We have a couple events going on over the next. It might be honestly a month or two, but we can work out it. We can take it offline.
Semester, but
Yeah.
for us, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Can we
Great.
please give Kerry a round of applause? The teachers in the room are basically professional slide deck makers, and that slide deck was not done in 10 minutes. This is obviously something that somebody put a lot of time in, and that was an amazing amount of time. And thank you again, CB Insights, for hosting us tonight and for giving us this amazing content and this amazing evening. We are just over the moon. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.